The world we built together was, for years, my refuge. From the moment I met her, everything seemed to align. Our goals, our dreams, even our struggles. Evelyn was my partner in every sense of the word. We married young, brimming with optimism, certain that we could conquer anything together. At the start, it felt like we had. Our home was modest but comfortable, perched at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was ours. We built it with love, from the paint on the walls to the garden that Evelyn tended with such care. Her green thumb brought life to everything she touched, and the backyard blossomed into a sanctuary of colors. Roses, lilies, and a sprawling oak tree that shaded the patio. I often joked that the garden looked better cared for than I did. She'd laugh, kiss me on the cheek, and assure me otherwise. We didn't have children. It was a choice we made early on, one that suited our lifestyle. Evelyn was deeply involved in her career, a respected art curator at the City Museum, and I owned a small but thriving graphic design firm. Our days were full, our evenings shared over quiet dinners, and our weekends often spent traveling or attending gallery openings. It was a life many envied, but more importantly, it was a life that felt complete to me. Financially, we weren't wealthy, but we were stable. We'd worked hard to get where we were, climbing from small apartments and long work hours to a place where we could breathe easily. The mortgage was manageable, the savings account slowly growing. We even indulged in little luxuries now and then. A new piece of art for the living room, a weekend getaway to the coast, or a particularly expensive bottle of wine to celebrate milestones. Evelyn's passion for art was infectious. She had a way of talking about paintings and sculptures that made them come alive, as if they had stories to tell. It was one of the things that had drawn me to her in the first place. Her ability to see beauty where others saw only brushstrokes. Her eyes would light up as she explained the history behind a piece or the intent of an artist. I admired her deeply for it, even if I didn't always understand the intricacies she described. I supported her career wholeheartedly. When she was promoted to lead curator, we celebrated as if she'd won the lottery. I remember the pride in her voice as she described the new responsibilities, the increased recognition. It meant longer hours and more late nights at the museum, but I didn't mind. I was proud of her, and I trusted her. That trust was the foundation of everything. I never questioned the late nights or the occasional weekends she spent preparing for exhibitions. I didn't blink when she mentioned colleagues. Names I barely remembered, faces I'd never seen. Her world was one I only glimpsed from the outside, but I was content with that. She had her sphere and I had mine. Looking back, there were moments that should have stood out. Fleeting signs, subtle shifts in tone or behavior that now seem glaringly obvious. But at the time, they were nothing more than faint ripples on the surface of our otherwise steady life. I dismissed them not out of naivety, but because I believed in her, in us. I can pinpoint the first time I felt a stir of unease, though I didn't recognize it for what it was. Evelyn had started mentioning a new colleague, someone she described as incredibly talented and insightful. She spoke of them with admiration, her eyes lighting up in that familiar way. First, I was happy for her. She deserved to work with people who inspired her. But as the mentions became more frequent, a tiny, unspoken question began to form in the back of my mind. I dismissed it as jealousy, not of the colleague, but of the time and energy she devoted to her work. I'd always known her career was demanding, and I'd always supported her unconditionally. This was no different, I told myself. She was passionate, and passion required sacrifice. In hindsight, those early moments were the beginning of a story I wasn't ready to face. They were the faint whispers of a storm on the horizon, a storm I was too blind to see. For now, I lived in the quiet comfort of our shared life, blissfully unaware of how fragile it truly was. The first signs of change crept into our lives so subtly that I hardly noticed them at first. Evelyn began mentioning him more often, this colleague she spoke of with such admiration. At first, it was always in passing, a detail about his input on an exhibit or a compliment about his artistic vision. She described him as brilliant, someone who saw the world differently and challenged her perspective. I didn't think much of it. Her enthusiasm for the people she worked with wasn't new. Over the years, there had been many colleagues she'd spoken highly of, though none seemed to occupy her thoughts as much as this one. Still, I trusted her, and I saw no reason to let jealousy take root in my mind. It wasn't my nature to question her devotion. If anything, I admired her passion and the way she surrounded herself with people who inspired her. As the weeks turned into months, his name became a fixture in our conversations. She frequently mentioned his contributions to the museum and the discussions they had about various exhibits. I listened attentively, offering supportive comments and asking questions to show my interest. But there was a growing sense of detachment in the way she spoke, a subtle shift that I couldn't quite articulate. Evelyn began spending more time at the museum. Late nights became routine, her weekends often consumed by preparations for upcoming exhibitions. I didn't question it, her job had always been demanding. But I couldn't ignore the way her absences left an emptiness in our home. The dinners we used to share became solitary affairs, and the laughter that once filled our evenings faded into silence. There were moments when I caught myself wondering about James. I'd never met him, but I began to form an image of him in my mind based on Evelyn's descriptions. He was clever, charismatic, and deeply immersed in the art world, qualities that mirrored her own in many ways. I told myself it was good that she had someone who understood her work so intimately. It made sense, I reasoned, that they would form a connection. But even as I rationalized it, I couldn't ignore the faint unease that began to creep into my thoughts. One afternoon, while Evelyn prepared for another late night at the museum, her movements seemed unusually deliberate. She appeared preoccupied, her responses to my casual remarks short and distant. It was a behavior I hadn't noticed before, one that lingered in my mind long after she left. It wasn't until much later that I began to recognize these subtle changes for what they were. Over time, I began to notice other changes. Evelyn's phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter or bedside table, was now always with her. She became more protective of her space, her energy shifting in ways I couldn't quite put into words. When I asked about her day, her answers grew shorter, less detailed, as if she was editing the narrative before sharing it with me. I brushed it off as stress or exhaustion from her demanding schedule, convincing myself that I was overthinking. One Saturday afternoon, while she was at the museum, I decided to visit her unannounced. It wasn't an act of suspicion, but rather an attempt to reconnect. I thought surprising her with coffee and a visit would brighten her day, reminding her of the bond we shared. I arrived at the museum and wandered through the familiar galleries, marveling at the exhibits she had curated. The staff greeted me warmly, accustomed to my occasional visits. I found her in one of the back rooms, engrossed in a discussion with James. Even without an introduction, I knew it was him. He was tall, with an easy confidence that seemed to fill the space around him. His gestures were animated as he spoke, and Evelyn watched him with an intensity one hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I stood unnoticed, observing the ease with which they interacted. They weren't doing anything inappropriate, but there was a familiarity between them that felt oddly intimate. When she noticed me standing there, her surprise was evident in the sudden stiffness of her posture. Her expression briefly betrayed an emotion I couldn't quite identify before she composed herself and walked toward me. The interaction felt awkward, the warmth that usually defined our exchanges noticeably absent. James acknowledged my presence with polite professionalism, expressing gratitude for the support I'd shown Evelyn in her work. As I observed the scene, a nagging feeling took root in my chest, a quiet unease that I couldn't shake. Their camaraderie was palpable, a dynamic that seemed to exist in a space separate from the world I shared with Evelyn. Despite the pleasant facade, something about the encounter left me unsettled. I left the museum that day with a heavy heart, the sense of disconnection growing stronger with each passing moment. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility that there was more to their connection than Evelyn had let on. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had no reason to doubt her. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. In the days that followed, my mind became a battleground of doubt and denial. I clung to the hope that I was mistaken, that the closeness I had witnessed was a product of my imagination. Yet, small inconsistencies began to pile up, their weight pressing down on me with unbearable intensity. Evelyn's behavior had shifted further, more guarded, more distant, as if she were carrying a secret too fragile to reveal. One evening, while she was in the shower, I noticed her phone lighting up with a notification. It wasn't something I typically paid attention to. We had always respected each other's privacy. But this time, curiosity got the better of me. The name on the screen was his James. A brief message, innocuous in its wording, but laden with an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. My stomach twisted as I placed the phone back where it had been, the implications gnawing at me. That night, Evelyn was more affectionate than she had been in weeks. Her touch lingered, her gaze soft yet distant. It was as if she sensed my growing unease and sought to soothe it without addressing its cause. In those moments, I felt the bittersweet sting of love and suspicion intertwining, a cruel dance that left me questioning everything we had built together. The following weeks were a blur of mounting tension. I began to notice patterns in her actions that I hadn't before. The way she would smile at her phone, the hurried explanations for her late nights, the faint scent of a cologne that wasn't mine lingering on her clothes. Each detail felt like a betrayal, a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Yet, I couldn't stop myself from searching for the truth. Evelyn's intimacy toward me took on a new dimension during this time, as if she were trying to reaffirm the bond between us. Her kisses were more fervent, her embrace tighter, her whispers of love tinged with a desperation I couldn't understand. It was as though she were trying to hold onto something slipping through her fingers, the weight of her actions casting a shadow over her affections. I began to question the sincerity of these moments. Were they born of guilt, a way to distract me from the growing chasm between us? Or were they genuine, a testament to the part of her that still loved me despite everything? These questions haunted me, their answers eluding my grasp as I struggled to navigate the tangled web of emotions enveloping our lives. One Friday evening, I decided to confront my suspicions in my own way. Evelyn had mentioned working late at the museum again, her tone casual yet hurried. As she left, I waited for some time before following. I felt a pang of guilt as I drove toward the museum, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming need to know the truth. My heart pounded in my chest as I parked a short distance away and approached the building. Through the large glass windows, I could see Evelyn standing in one of the galleries. She wasn't alone. James was there, his stance relaxed yet attentive as he spoke to her. Their proximity was closer than necessary, their body language intimate in a way that felt deeply personal. They weren't touching, but the connection between them was unmistakable, an unspoken bond that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. I stood in the shadows, unseen, my breath shallow as I watched them. The scene before me felt surreal, like a tableau frozen in time. Evelyn's laughter reached my ears, soft and melodic, a sound I hadn't heard from her in months. It was a laugh that once belonged to us, a private melody that now seemed to belong to someone else. As the minutes passed, their interaction grew more intimate. James reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from Evelyn's face, his touch lingering longer than necessary. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, her expression one of vulnerability and longing. The sight pierced through me, a dagger of betrayal that left me frozen in place. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, disbelief. The images of their closeness played on a loop in my mind, each replay amplifying the pain in my chest. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I returned home and sat in the darkness, the weight of what I'd seen suffocating me. Evelyn returned hours later, her demeanor unchanged, her smile as radiant as ever. She kissed me goodnight, her lips warm against mine, the taste of her affection now bitter with the knowledge I carried. I lay awake long after she fell asleep, my thoughts a chaotic mess of love, betrayal, and the dawning realization that our life together had been irreparably altered. The morning light filtered through the curtains, a soft glow that failed to dispel the storm raging within me. Evelyn stirred beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful, a a stark contrast to the chaos in my heart. The betrayal was now an undeniable truth, yet I remained silent, unwilling to shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy. I felt trapped in a liminal space, caught between the love I once knew and the reality I now faced. In the days that followed, I began to observe Evelyn with a new intensity, my every action a quiet act of reconnaissance. Her habits, once so familiar, now seemed laden with hidden meanings. She continued to move through our shared life with grace and ease, her affection unwavering, yet I could see the subtle cracks in her demeanor. Her smiles lingered a moment too long, her laughter carried an edge of nervousness, and her touch felt like a desperate attempt to bridge the growing chasm between us. I kept my composure, maintaining the facade of ignorance while my mind raced with plans. Revenge was not something I had ever considered before. It was foreign, an alien emotion that conflicted with my nature. Yet, the depth of her betrayal demanded retribution. It was no longer a matter of preserving our relationship but reclaiming the dignity and trust that had been stolen from me. The question was how to execute it, how to make her feel the weight of her actions without revealing my hand too soon. The first step was subtle, a shift in my behavior that was almost imperceptible. I began to withdraw, not entirely, but just enough to create a sense of unease. My responses to her questions became more measured, my presence less predictable. I spent more time away from home, immersing myself in work and hobbies that had once been a peripheral part of my life. Evelyn noticed, of course, her concern evident in the way she sought my attention with greater urgency. But I remained steadfast, offering no explanation for my detachment. Next, I began to plant seeds of doubt. I'd leave my phone unlocked on the counter, its screen displaying cryptic messages from colleagues or notifications from events she hadn't known I attended. I started dressing with more care, my appearances suddenly sharper, more polished. I could see the questions forming in her mind, the uncertainty flickering in her eyes, but she never voiced them. Instead, she tried harder to pull me back into the fold of our life together, her efforts tinged with an undercurrent of desperation. One evening, I suggested we host a dinner party, an event we hadn't done in years. Evelyn was thrilled at the idea, throwing herself into the preparations with a fervor that almost made me believe in her sincerity. We invited friends and colleagues, a mix of familiar faces and new acquaintances. Among them, I ensured James was present, his inclusion a calculated move to stir the pot further. The night of the party arrived, and the atmosphere was vibrant, filled with laughter and conversation. Evelyn moved through the room with effortless charm, her charisma drawing people in as it always had. James's presence didn't go unnoticed. He stayed close to her side, their interactions subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. I watched from a distance, my expression neutral, my emotions tightly controlled. As the evening progressed, I began to weave my own narrative, engaging our guests with anecdotes and stories that subtly painted Evelyn and James in a certain light. My words were carefully chosen, innocuous on the surface but laced with implications that planted doubt and suspicion in the minds of those around us. By the end of the night, I could see the ripple effect taking hold, the whispered conversations and stolen glances that signaled the start of a slow unraveling. Evelyn seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, her focus entirely on maintaining the perfect image of our life together. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks became too wide to ignore. My plan was not one of immediate confrontation but a slow, methodical dismantling of the facade she had built. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, to watch as the foundation of her carefully curated world crumbled around her. The days following the party were marked by a growing tension. Evelyn became more withdrawn, her usual confidence giving way to unease. She began to question me more often, her inquiries tinged with suspicion. I offered no answers, my silence a weapon that spoke volumes. The power dynamic between us had shifted, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over the narrative of our lives. Each step I took was deliberate, each action calculated to achieve maximum impact. I began to document everything, the messages I had seen on her phone, the changes in her behavior, the interactions between her and James. It wasn't enough to confront her with words. I needed evidence, something undeniable that would leave no room for excuses or justifications. My goal was not just to expose the truth, but to ensure that it could never be buried again. As I moved through this phase of my plan, I found a strange sense of clarity. The anger and sadness that had consumed me were now tempered by a cold, calculated resolve. I was no longer the passive observer of my own life, but an active participant, shaping the outcome with every choice I made. The man I had been, the one who trusted without question, who loved without reservation, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who refused to be defined by betrayal. Evelyn continued to act as though nothing had changed, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. She was no longer the confident, composed woman I had known, but someone grappling with the consequences of her actions. And as I watched her unravel, I felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that the path I had chosen would lead to a reckoning she could not escape. The days following the execution of my plans were eerily quiet. The storm I had unleashed moved silently, leaving devastation in its wake, though none of it was visible on the surface. Evelyn remained oblivious to the depth of my actions, going about her days with an air of strained normalcy, unaware that every step she took was now part of a path I had carved out for her. I had prepared for this moment with precision. Every detail, every choice I made was deliberate. The accounts I had transferred to separate holdings were secure, inaccessible to her. The digital trail of her indiscretions was stored in encrypted files, evidence that would ensure her public image. Her carefully curated persona as a sophisticated curator and loyal partner would crumble if ever challenged. But more than the financial and reputational fallout, I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done, not through confrontation, but through absence. The final act began with the letter. It was handwritten, concise, and devoid of emotion. It served as my farewell not just to Evelyn, but to the life we had built together. I left it on the kitchen table, the same place where we had once shared meals and laughter, where our lives had felt intertwined. Now it was merely a resting place for the last words I would ever offer her. The contents of the letter were simple yet definitive, outlining my awareness of her betrayal and my decision to leave. There was no anger in the words, only a quiet resolution. Alongside the letter, I placed a folder containing evidence of her infidelity. It was a meticulous collection of emails, photos, and timelines that documented the affair in painful detail. It wasn't meant for public use. Its sole purpose was to ensure she could never deny the truth to herself. Leaving the house for the last time, I felt an unexpected calm. The weight that had burdened me for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. I had no destination in mind, only the certainty that I would never look back. The life I had shared with Evelyn was over, and ahead lay the vast unknown. A chance to rebuild, to redefine myself away from the shadows of her betrayal. As I drove away, the memories of our life together flashed through my mind. The laughter, the shared dreams, the moments of quiet intimacy. They all seemed like fragments of a story that belonged to someone else. I realized that the man who had once cherished those moments no longer existed. In his place was someone who had learned the harsh truths of love and trust, someone who now understood the strength it took to walk away. Evelyn would eventually discover the letter, the empty closets, and the absence of my presence in her life. She would see the evidence and come to terms with the reality she had tried so hard to conceal. Perhaps she would feel regret, or perhaps she would justify her actions to herself. It didn't matter anymore. Her thoughts, her feelings, her life, they were no longer my concern. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the lies, the doubts, and the pain of betrayal. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to choose. And as I drove further away from the life I had left behind, I allowed myself a small, bittersweet smile. The past was gone, and with it, the weight of Evelyn's betrayal. What lay ahead was a blank slate, an unwritten story waiting to unfold. And this time it would be a story of my choosing, one where I would no longer be defined by someone else's choices but by my own resilience and strength. As I settled into the unfamiliar solitude of my new life, the days felt both liberating and disorienting. Without the structure of our shared routines, time stretched before me like an empty canvas. The mornings began quietly, the absence of her presence amplifying the silence. Yet, it was in this emptiness that I began to reclaim pieces of myself I hadn't realized I had lost. I found solace in simplicity. Walking through unfamiliar neighborhoods, I let the crisp air clear my thoughts. The chaos I had left behind no longer clung to me, though echoes of it occasionally surfaced. A passing glance at a couple walking hand in hand, a song on the radio that evoked memories of better times. These moments came and went, like shadows that danced at the edges of my consciousness but no longer consumed me. The transition was not without its challenges. There were nights when I woke abruptly, the weight of what I'd endured pressing heavily on my chest. In those moments, I allowed myself to feel the grief not for Evelyn, but for the man I had been, the man who had trusted so fully, so blindly. It wasn't self-pity, but rather a necessary reckoning with the scars her betrayal had left. Gradually, I began to rebuild. I threw myself into projects that reignited my passion, rediscovering interests that had been pushed aside during the years of compromise. Photography became a refuge, a way to see the world anew through the lens of possibility. Each captured frame felt like a reclamation of my agency, a reminder that beauty and meaning could still exist, even in the aftermath of destruction. Letters from Evelyn began to arrive a few weeks after my departure. She wrote with desperation, her carefully composed words betraying the unraveling of her carefully constructed facade. She apologized profusely, pleading for an explanation, for a second chance, for closure. I read each letter only once before discarding it. There was no point in responding. Her words no longer held any power over me. The silence I maintained was my final act of defiance, a boundary she could not cross. One afternoon, as I sifted through old photographs from happier times, I found myself reflecting not on the pain she had caused, but on the lessons I had learned. Evelyn's betrayal had shattered the foundation of my life, but it had also forced me to confront truths I had long ignored, about her, about myself, and about the fragility of trust. In her absence, I had discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a resilience that allowed me to rebuild from the rubble. The world no longer felt as small as it once had. Opportunities began to present themselves. New connections, new horizons, new dreams. Slowly but surely, I was becoming someone new, someone untethered from the weight of the past. And though the wounds she had inflicted would always remain, they no longer defined me. They were simply part of my story, a chapter one had closed with finality. As the months passed, the ache of betrayal faded into a distant memory. What lingered was not bitterness but clarity, a sense of freedom that came from knowing I had taken control of my life. For the first time in years, I was no longer bound by someone else's choices. I was free to choose my path, to write my own story. And as I stood on the threshold of this new chapter, I felt a quiet, unshakable certainty. I was finally home, within myself.